Welcome to Fish University, your one-stop shop for the science behind fish management. It is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network. I'm Wes Neal, your host. I'm an extension professor of fisheries and a researcher for Mississippi State University. Join me as I talk to researchers, managers, and landowners about the tools and science and the tricks of the trade for managing fish, water, and habitat. The goal is for you to have better fishing and a healthier aquatic ecosystem. So grab a notebook and the beverage of your choice and relax and enjoy Fish University. Hello everyone and welcome to Fish University. You know, it's that time of year again when avid anglers head offshore to the Gulf of Mexico chasing one of the most delicious fish species, red snapper. This species lives on submerged natural and artificial reefs and other structures in waters as shallow as 15 feet and much, much deeper. But as popular as this species is amongst anglers, it's just as controversial. So I have invited Dr. Marcus Drymon, an assistant extension professor of marine fisheries ecology, to join us and discuss everything about red snapper. Marcus is stationed on the Gulf of Mexico at Mississippi State University's Coastal Research and Extension Center. Marcus, how are you doing today?
Wes, I'm doing really well. So thank you so much for having me on this podcast. It's really exciting to be able to talk about this fish that you said is such a popular and iconic species.
And it's really nasty here today. The weather looks just awful outside. Is it just as bad down on the coast?
Yeah, you know it is. And as fish guys, I know you and I would much rather be out on the water, but today we both find ourselves in our offices. So here we are.
Yeah, certainly. The weather this spring has just been so up and down. It's kind of hard to keep track of it all. But I wanted to talk to you because, you know, red snapper is a very important fishery to the Gulf of Mexico. It is a very controversial fishery. And even though we're recording this in April, this will probably air in June, which is about the time that the red snapper season opens. So I'm hoping that this comes on the air when people can hear about it and learn a little bit about this species that is so popular. So tell me a little bit about your background, how you got into marine fish ecology.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, like many young kids, I grew up just fascinated with the natural world, but particularly the ocean. And that love of the ocean ultimately led to a love of fishes. You know, like you, I'm a fish guy. I love fishing. I love studying fish. I love learning about fish. And I've been able to turn that into a career that's let me look at all different types of species, all different types of fishes, you know, from sharks to tarpon to triple tail and jack crevalle. But really a lot of the work I do is focused on red snapper. And it's because it's such a, like you said, such an iconic species. And a species that we're still learning more about to this day. But as you mentioned, you know, I'm an assistant extension professor here at Mississippi State University. I've been here for the past 5 or 6 years. And I think this institute, this university, and this department suit me to a T. So really thrilled to be here.
Excellent. You mentioned all the other species you work with. I think those are all topics for future podcast episodes.
I hope so. I'd love to talk about those too.
But you weren't born on the ocean, right? Weren't you sort of an inland guy to start with?
Oh, absolutely. I'm from a landlocked state called Kentucky. My wife and I both are from central Kentucky. My family still lives in central Kentucky. And for those of you listening that haven't been there, it's a beautiful, beautiful part of the world. But I had the opportunity to travel a lot as a young man. My dad is an airline pilot. And so we got the opportunity to go to lots of coastal places. And, you know, the first time one sees the ocean, it's a pretty memorable event. And, you know, I was really struck by the enormity of it and have really just been fascinated with it ever since.
So you fell in love with the ocean. And one of the things you first discovered was marine fishermen and marine managers don't always agree on things, right?
They don't, you know, and that's an interesting point that you raise. You think about fisheries. And you don't always necessarily think about fisheries scientists or fisheries managers and the fact that they often, you know, are doing different things, but to the same end, right? But there is at least a perceived conflict there oftentimes. You know, I'm fond of using the phrase that fisheries management and fisheries science are equally important. They're essentially like two sides of the same coin, right? You can't have one exist without the other. So they're both incredibly important. But red snapper really illustrates an example of where there's a lot of devil in the details, so to speak.
So, with the red snapper, we know that they are one of the most popular marine species or sport fish species to target. Just how important is this fishery to the Gulf Coast?
Goodness, it would truly be impossible to overstate the importance of the red snapper fishery to the Gulf Coast. Now, that's whether you're on the west coast of Florida or all the way over in Texas. It is definitely, with respect to reef fishes, it's the Gulf's iconic reef fish fishery. It truly is number one. It stands out by itself. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I like to think of red snapper as the everyman's fish. Most folks can get out and catch a red snapper, whether it's on a party boat or a charter boat or fishing close to shore on a personal boat. They're not particularly deep water fish, although they can be. And they're relatively easy to find. They're in relatively high abundance. They're relatively easy to catch. And they taste really, really good. So, all those things put together, it makes it just, it's every man's fish.
And this fishery has been important for a long time. Can you talk a little bit about how it developed and some of the controversy that goes around snapper fishing and the management of red snapper?
Yeah, actually, I'd be pleased to, because it's really fascinating and it exemplifies a lot of the issues that are really common to multiple fisheries, not just red snapper. But to really tell this story right, we'd have to go back several hundred years. So imagine what the Gulf of Mexico looked like back in the 1840s, because really and honestly, that's the first time that we have historical records of red snapper being landed in the Gulf of Mexico. And you might imagine this fishery originated in the Western Gulf, but that wouldn't be the case. It actually originated in the Eastern Gulf. Now, today, when we think about the distribution of red snapper, we tend to see it more as a Western Gulf of Mexico stock, but the fishery was first initiated and executed off the coast of Pensacola, again, as early as the 1840s. And if you just visualize what this looked like, this was a fishery that was being executed from these tiny little wooden smacks. So, 16 to 18 foot wooden boats that were powered by wind, right, with sails, or where you rowed out to catch your red snapper. And that's how the fishery began. And even so, a very small commercial fishery was able to land a large quantity of red snapper. Now, fast forward a few years, and all of a sudden there's more ice available. Trains and locomotive routes are available to take these fish to different ports. And then all of a sudden the fishery, if you can imagine, back in the middle 1800s or so, this fishery already began to become overfished or depleted in local areas. And so that's remarkable. We think about a very low budget, low technology fishery that's very small in scale. And even that is able to put a serious dent into the population of red snapper at the time. So there's a really great book that I've recommended to a bunch of people. It's written by Jack Davis. It's a Pulitzer Prize winning book called The Gulf, The Making of an American Sea. And one of my favorite quotes from that book was a quote by Mr. Collins back in 1887. And this quote really gives you an idea of the magnitude of the depletion in the red snapper fishery all the way back then, more than 100 years, 150 years ago. And the quote goes like this: "Localities that were once remarkable for the abundance of fish on them only a year ago are now of comparatively little importance, and vessels are continually obliged to extend further off in order to meet with success." So if we think about that, here we are in the late 1800s, localized pots of red snapper off the coast of Florida, Eastern Gulf of Mexico, are already starting to become depleted. And so what happens when a stock of fish gets reduced such that it's no longer profitable to fish for them? Well, the fishery moves. And we saw that, about the early 1900s or so, we see the center of the fishery shift from Pensacola off the coast of Florida, and we see it go down to the Campeche banks in Mexico. And You might be wondering, well, why were we fishing in Mexico? Well, of course, this was before the Magnuson-Stevens Act, where anybody can really fish wherever they want to. So at this point, we have fishermen going as far south as the southern Gulf of Mexico in order to harvest this fish. And that in and of itself really gives you an idea of how important this fish was in this fishery. To put that into perspective, commercial landings for red snapper in the early 1900s exceeded 7 million pounds. That's along the same magnitude of what the fishery is executed at now. But again, that was happening back in the early 1900s, which is just, I mean, it's really kind of mind-boggling to think about that. So fast forward a few years, right? We've gone from the development of the fishery in the 1840s to the expansion of the fishery in the late 1800s, early 1900s, down to the southern Gulf. We have landings peak at around 7 million pounds in the early 1900s, and then something happens in the 30s and 40s, World War II. And so fishing kind of dies down for a while. People stop focusing on fishing for a while. But it's notable that as soon as the war was over, we really, in my estimation, have at least three things that happened that exploded fishery for red snapper. So first and foremost, largely because of the war, we were able to make these large technological advancements, things like fathometers, things like widely applicable and relatively cheap fiberglass boats. All of these things made it easier for a lot more people to be on the water and fish for red snapper. Number one. Number two, the commercial fishery really took off. So soldiers that had made it home from the war, some of them decided they wanted to make their living commercial fishing for red snapper. That fishery really expands and takes off. Also, the shrimp trawl fishery expands and takes off. And that's a whole separate issue. But as it turns out, the shrimp trawl fishery incidentally or accidentally harvests lots and lots of very, very small red snapper, which causes mortality on the age 1 and age 0s to be relatively high. And then the third thing is the recreational fishery in the United States really started to take off. If you can imagine a post-World War II United States when people were feeling better just about life in general and were enjoying leisure activities like recreational fishing. Well, now you have a heavy commercial fishery and you have a rapidly growing recreational fishery. So, fast forward a few more years to the modern times, about 1950s, we see effort steadily increasing, both commercial and recreational, for the red snapper in that fishery. And then we see landings pretty steadily decreasing. And that, in a nutshell, is kind of the history of the red snapper fishery in the Gulf of Mexico up until more or less modern times. But again, a fishery that was first initiated back as early as 1840.
It's interesting. You mentioned the small wooden smacks is what you called them. That struck a chord with me because one of my few trips that I've taken for red snapper, we took kayaks into the Gulf of Mexico out about 3.5 miles fishing for red snappers in a sea kayak, but a kayak nevertheless. And the waves that day were probably 5 to 6 footers. It was just a really odd feeling to be in a small kayak out in that large body of water.
So really, you can put yourself in a position where you can very clearly imagine what those fishermen were feeling back in the 1800s when there weren't outboard engines, and jet drives and things like that. So it's a feeling where you can feel very small when you're in a small boat out in a big sea like that. I totally get that.
So you brought us up to sort of modern times, and then I guess, what was it, around 1980s or so, that the population was considered to have crashed or to have been so low that they began to implement moratoriums on the fisheries?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So about 1980, 1990, things kind of hit a critical threshold, and it was decided that, man, this population of red snapper in the Gulf of Mexico has plummeted. The stock has collapsed. We need to take some pretty serious measures to start to rebuild that fishery. And at that time, NOAA Fisheries and the Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council sort of threw the gamut of techniques that fisheries resource managers use to try to reduce harvest in a fishery. So they set a limit on the number of fish that can be harvested commercially. They instituted license limits. So no longer can just anyone go apply for a commercial red snapper fishing license. They put a cap on that, a ceiling on that. For the recreational fishermen, they introduced bag limits, trip limits, all those sort of standard tools, implemented some seasonal closures. You can no longer fish 365 days a year for red snapper. All of that's kind of on the commercial and recreational fishing side of things, but they also implemented measures in the shrimp trawl fishery to try to reduce that harvest of those 0 and 1s. And I say harvest, what I mean is the incidental bite catch. Shrimp fishermen certainly aren't trying to kill lots of little red snapper, but the way those nets work, that was what was happening. So they introduced a device called a BIRD, a bycatch reduction device, a BRD. And that device allowed for many of those little age 0 and 1 red snapper to escape. So round about the 80s, 90s, we have all this suite of methods being implemented to try to bring the red snapper fishery back in line. But then another milestone happened around 2005. So they tried these approaches from about the 90s to about 2005, about 15 years. Nothing's really working. So they say, okay, we need a new approach. So that's when things really started to get slashed. That recreational bag limit that was first introduced went from 5 to 2. So reduced by more than half. The commercial quota, the overall amount of fish that a commercial fisherman could harvest, was essentially cut in half. And then the minimum size that a commercial fisherman could keep was reduced. That may not make intuitive sense, but the thought behind that is, if fishermen are having to discard a lot of these red snapper because they're too small, that leads to a relatively high discard mortality. So the thought is, well, if we reduce the size of the fish that they can keep, they'll keep more of those small ones and reduce that discard mortality. A couple more things happened around that, 2005 or so. They implemented something called an IFQ. Now, for folks that don't think a lot about fisheries, that's kind of a strange concept. An IFQ is an individual fishing quota. And it's this idea that commercial fishermen, let's say there's 100 commercial fishermen in the world, and there's 100 tons of fish that can be harvested from the commercial aspect. And so each of those fishermen gets 1 ton of fish to harvest. It's taking that whole commercial quota and dividing it equally among individual commercial fishermen. That's the IFQ system, and that was implemented in 2005. So lots of dramatic changes that took the stock that was really, really declining substantially up through the 80s and 90s. And then again in 2005, we start to implement all of these new things. And in the past 15 years or so, since then, more or less, we've seen a stock that's on a rebuilding trajectory. Now, given a lot of different factors, not the least of which is the life history of this fish, red snapper, can grow to be very, very old. So for a myriad of reasons, the stock is not yet fully rebuilt, but since 2005, it's definitely been on an upward trajectory. It's slowly rebuilding.
And that is some of the controversy around these fish, right? That the fishermen go out and they fish their favorite spots and they catch many small snappers, and they're like, these things are everywhere. We can't get through them to get to the grouper. So they get the perception that the snapper are fine, they're abundant, and that a lot of these restrictions are not necessary. But in reality, what they're catching are young fish, and those young fish have not yet had a chance to grow up to become older, larger fish. Is that roughly what's going on?
That's not roughly. That's exactly what's going on. So that's very well said. You see a lot of small fish in a fishery, and that's a good sign. That's a sign of strong year classes, strong cohorts. But if those small fish aren't given a chance to reach reproductive size and reproductive age, they're not contributing to the next strong cohort. So what fishermen see and identify is accurate. Of course, they're not wrong. There are lots of those smaller red snapper, and increasingly each year you should expect to see more and more of the slightly larger and slightly larger and slightly larger red snapper as those young, strong year classes mature and add to the biomass of the fishery. So it's a very good thing that fishermen are seeing this, but I understand their frustration. And it really, not to overuse this term, but it's a bit of a shifting baseline. I mean, because what looks to be a very healthy stock today wouldn't have been considered a relatively healthy stock 50 or 100 years ago, before the onset of so much commercial and recreational fishing pressure. But they've seen a stock that's recovering very nicely over the past 10 years. And they get mad that they're not able to harvest more fish. And I totally understand that. But unfortunately, these biological and ecological cycles just take a long time to complete. So the fact that we're seeing what the fishermen see on the water is a really good thing. We're just not quite where we need to be to ensure the future sustainability of the stock.
Why are red snapper managed so differently in state waters versus federal waters? Why are they not just managed the same everywhere?
Wow. Yeah. I mean, that's a really good question. And I have a couple answers for that. The short answer is that it's the private recreational angler. So if we think about it this way, commercial fishermen and their catch are relatively easy to track. There's like a set amount of them, and it's not an overwhelming amount. And they have multiple avenues by which they have to report their individual, their fish. They have these IFQs, that individual fishing quota, and they are on the hook, no pun intended, to report every single fish that they catch. So there's systems in place that very closely and accurately track the number of fish removed from the commercial fishery. Now, with the private recreational fishery, it's much, much different, right? There's no limit on how many people can go out and fish for red snapper. And accordingly, it's much harder to track how many fish are removed from the recreational sector. So NOAA Fisheries has really wrestled with this concept, and they've made a lot of changes. They've instituted a lot of changes in how they attempt to track harvest from the private recreational sector. So if we think about what that looked like in the late 70s, think about a program called MRFS, MRFSS, the Marine Recreational Fisheries Statistics Survey. And if you were alive in the late 70s and you wanted to give information to somebody, you did that through the telephone, right? So NIMS, through the MRFS survey, used what's called CHTS, the Household Telephone Survey, Coastal Household Telephone Survey. So they would literally call people and ask them, how many red snapper did you catch, last month or whatever. They also used angler intercepts, where they would meet anglers at the dock and try to gauge how many fish they had caught while they were on their trip that day. But, as you can imagine, that was in the 70s. By the 2000s and, 2010, people don't really use their household telephone, at least the way that they did back in the 70s. So NIMS recognized, well, we probably better modernize the way we are collecting this recreational angler data. And so they did. They created a new program called MRIP, the Marine Recreational Information Program. Now, that uses a completely different approach, a much more modern approach. But regardless of, the MRFS program versus the MRIP program, it's fair to say that tracking recreational fishing statistics is very difficult. There's just a lot of uncertainty there. And so, as a consequence, individual states in the Gulf of Mexico decided, you know what, we think we could do a much better job of tracking the harvest of red snapper in our own state than the federal government can do. That led to some really big changes only relatively recently. So, we go from the MRF system in the 70s to the MRIP system, that started around 2008. And then in 2018, Louisiana was the first state that said, you know what, we don't want to use the MRIP system. It's broken. It's not accurate. It in no way reflects what anglers off Louisiana are catching in terms of red snapper. So we want to build our own program. And they did. And it's called LaCreel, LA Creel Survey, Louisiana, Creel Survey. And in 2018, LaCreel was certified by NOAA Fisheries as a suitable replacement for MRIP. In other words, the state of Louisiana no longer participates in the MRIP program. They have their own system. And that system is really, really well received by Louisiana stakeholders. And so that kind of that was the first snowball that started an avalanche, so to speak. So after 2018, the rest of the Gulf of Mexico states said, yeah, we want to have our own program too. We want to do our own accounting of red snapper. And that led to Amendment 50, which was a really landmark moment in the management of Gulf of Mexico red snapper. It was NOAA Fisheries saying, okay, we agree, we're giving each of you 5 Gulf of Mexico states the ability to manage your own portion of the recreational catch of red snapper. And they said, we're going to do this for a 2-year trial basis. And so each state came up with their own way of doing it. In our state, we use something called tails and scales. And again, that's been really, really well received by Mississippi anglers. It's a program that was designed and developed and is still administered by the MDMR, the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources. And like anything these days, it's an app. So when you leave the dock, you hail out on that app. You have to start a trip. When you catch a red snapper, you have to log that red snapper. And when you get back, you close your trip. But, it's a relatively painless process. And honestly, Mississippi residents, by and large, I'm making a generalization, but all the anglers I speak to would much rather have a red snapper tracked through tails and scales in a way that's easy for them, rather than letting NOAA Fisheries do it using the kind of outdated and problematic methods that they've had to use. So just a year or two ago in 2020, the council, the Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council, said, okay, you guys tried that for 2018 and 2019. We're now going to make this kind of the permanent situation. Every state gets to manage red snapper in their own, state, and we're going to give individual quotas to each state. Alabama's going to get about a quarter. Florida's going to get about half of the private recreational harvest. Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas all get smaller pieces of the pie for a number of reasons. But suffice it to say, now the states can say, all right, well, in Mississippi, we choose to start our fishery on this day, and people can fish whenever they want. We'll periodically, during that season, update our landings data to make sure we haven't exceeded the quota. If there happens to be really bad weather on 4th of July weekend, for example, we know harvest will go down, and so we can adjust. We can extend the season a little bit later into the fall. Again, a generalization, but by and large, it's been a really, really positive move by NOAA Fisheries, through the council, and by each of the 5 Gulf of Mexico states. And it's allowed each state to have a lot more flexibility in determining how the red snapper directly off their coasts are managed.
And the state jurisdiction, that goes out to 3 miles, is that right?
What a good question. So answer is complicated. Traditionally, the state waters are from the shore out to 3 miles. Now in Texas, that's not the case. On the east coast of Florida, that is the case. On the west coast of Florida, it goes out to 9 miles. So even in Florida, there's a difference. But as of relatively recently, that has changed a little bit. So now in Mississippi, state waters go out to 3 miles unless we're talking about reef fishes, which of course a red snapper is a reef fish. Now, Mississippi manages reef fishes out to 9 nautical miles. So depends on where you're fishing in the Gulf of Mexico, and it depends on what you're fishing for. So 3 miles is a good rule of thumb, but if you're in Mississippi and you're fishing for a reef fish, it's actually 9 miles.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Most people don't. It's kind of a nuanced rule. I mean, you literally have to define the state boundary differently based on what you're fishing for, which is strange.
So now we're talking about the recreational fishery, but there's a recreational fishery and there's a commercial fishery. And a number of studies in recent years have suggested that the value of a fish caught recreationally is much greater than the value of a fish caught commercially. But yet, doesn't commercial fishing still get a greater portion of the pie when it comes to red snapper?
Yeah. So, I appreciate that you're really asking a lot of the questions that we get a lot, in our role in extension. And they're pointed questions and they're difficult questions. So yes, if you think about the value of a fish from a recreational fishery and its catch and release value, the value that fish brings to its local economy based on people that travel from a long distance just to catch and release that fish, the fact that fish can be caught and released multiple times, there's a lot of different ways to look at that particular scenario for sure. But to be clear, the red snapper fishery in the Gulf of Mexico is divided almost equally, half and half. So the commercial sector gets 51% and the recreational sector gets 49%. So very close to a 50-50 split. But people would argue, well, the commercial fishery is a relatively small group of people, and the recreational fishery is millions of people. So why does that make sense? And that argument is a reasonable argument. Not too long ago, back in the 90s, I think it was 1990, there was a motion by the council to reallocate that split. So you know what? We really need to put more of that quota on the recreational side and take some away from the commercial side. And ultimately, the courts decided that that was not legal. So they said, well, based on harvests from 1970s through the 80s, this is how this fishery is executed. It's a little bit more commercial than it is recreational. Therefore, we need to allocate a little bit more of the total number of red snapper to the commercial fishery rather than the recreational fishery. The exact opposite is true for greater amberjack. Since the majority of greater amberjack are harvested recreationally, there's a much higher percentage of the overall quota allocated to the recreational sector. But again, for Gulf red snapper, roughly 50-50. But an important designation should be made there. So in 2011, that's when that amendment was reintroduced, Amendment 28, where the council said, the rec guys need more than the 49%. And the court said, no, we can't do that. But in 2015, another really notable event happened. And it's important to make this distinction. So there's roughly 50% commercial, roughly 50% recreational, but that recreational portion of the pie actually has two components, right? It's your private recreational angler, but it's also a sector called the for-hire sector. So when someone from Idaho comes down to the Mississippi Gulf Coast and they take out a charter boat, that charter boat is part of the for-hire sector. And they are technically considered recreational fishermen because they're not selling their fish. But that for-hire sector wanted a defined piece of that recreational quota separate from the private recreational citizen. And so in 2015, that happened, and that's called sector separation. That was a really defining moment in the history of Gulf of Mexico red snapper management. And so now, if you think about this pie, roughly half is commercial, roughly a quarter is for the private recreational angler, and roughly a quarter is for the charter for hire industry. So lots of calculus going into how those decisions are made, but that's how those allocations break out across the sectors.
How was that received amongst the recreational public?
Not well, not well at all. And so the private anglers said, listen, we are a massive group of people. We don't want to have such a small portion of the pie. The commercial anglers, the for hire sector, chefs, environmentalists, things like that said exactly the opposite. They said, yes, you're a large component of the overall fishery, but you're also the component that routinely exceeds the amount that you're able to harvest. Not because any one individual is being selfish or breaking the rules, but simply because it is so difficult to track the number of fish that are actually being removed from the private recreational sector. It's a gargantuan task. And the bigger our population gets and the more popular recreational rod and reel fishing gets, the harder that is to track. So through no one's fault, that sector routinely exceeds its total allowable catch. But suffice it to say, there is almost constantly tension between commercial sectors and recreational sectors. And that really goes beyond red snapper. That can be applied to most fisheries on the planet, or at least in our country. Maybe it's not like that in other places, but no, the short answer is that didn't go over particularly well with the private recreational angling community.
Thanks, Marcus. And one of the questions I have is about bycatch, because as a snapper angler, I know that when you're fishing really deep for them, you deal with things like barotrauma. You certainly could have deep hooked fish, other catch-related mortalities. But also, one thing I've experienced has been predation or depredation by dolphins, for example. Are some of the length restrictions that we have on snapper, are they sometimes counterproductive in terms of protecting those smaller fish that are being caught and released? Are they getting a chance to grow up?
So, that's an unbelievably good question. And really, a lot of people have spent a lot of time over the past 5 to 10 years really trying to dig down into the nuances of that. My research group included, we spent a lot of time thinking about post-release mortality, predation following release, post-release predation. And in particular, we spend a lot of time thinking about depredation, which is when a fish is bitten in half before it's even brought to the boat. So, to start with the first thing that you mentioned, this idea of bycatch. When you're harvesting lots, let's say for every 10 fish you catch, maybe 7 of them are undersized. So because of that regulation, that length regulation, you're forced to throw those fish back. Those fish have some probability of surviving that release event. We'd like to think that every fish we release returns happy to the wild and lives to fight another day, but that's simply not the case. And we can measure that post-release mortality. We've done several studies to estimate what post-release mortality rates are for things like amberjack and red snapper. And the numbers are always higher than we would like, right? Even if it's a 20% post-release mortality. So for every 10 fish that you throw back, 2 are going to die. So you could argue, well, that length-based restriction is not functioning as intended. And so as recently as 2020, Congress introduced something called the Descend Act. And it's a clever acronym, I'm sure. But the concept of the Descend Act is to mandate that anglers in the Gulf of Mexico have with them tools to help reduce post-release mortality, post-release predation. So specifically, you have to have on your boat a venting tool, so a way to decompress the swim bladder of a fish that experiences barotrauma, or a descender device, which is simply like a boga grip for the mouth that's attached to a fishing line that drags the fish back down to the depth where it was captured. And all of that legislation is really to get at that issue that you asked about. How do we reduce the mortality of fish that we're releasing? Because we can only reduce the fishing pressure and the fishing mortality so much. Obviously, we can't do anything about natural mortality. So where else can we start to narrow the mortality experienced by these fish within the fishery? And the answer sometimes is the post-release mortality or the bycatch mortality. So those are things that we are constantly looking at, and it's the focus of a lot of ongoing current research.
I was on a boat once offshore from Pensacola. We were probably 40 or 50 miles offshore fishing in 300 or 400 feet of water for other reef fish, and someone caught a really large red snapper. I mean, this was a 20-plus pound fish, and brought it to the surface. And, of course, it wasn't seasoned in the federal waters, so they had to release it. And I'll never forget watching the dropped the fish back in the water, and it floated there at the surface, couldn't descend as we continued to fish. And we'll just watch this large, massive fish float away. So I can understand why having things like a descender device is important to get that fish back down. Because what people don't understand with barotrauma, what it is, a fish has an air bladder, and at 200 feet deep, the pressure is extremely high. So as you bring the fish up, that air bladder expands under less and less pressure. And by the time you get it to the surface, it's either so expanded that it can't go back down, it can't reduce the gas pressure enough to go back down, or it causes it to eject its stomach out its mouth. It's certainly not a good thing for the fish. And when you bring them up from such a depth, it's going to cause problems like this that will cause mortality if you don't help that fish recover from that barotrauma. The other thing I would mention with the predation is one of the things I've noticed fishing more inshore is the dolphins have learned what fishermen look like. We'll set up on a reef fishing for snapper, but every fish we're catching is 13, 14, 15 inches. You catch the fish, you try to get it up as quickly as you can to get it away from the dolphins who are sitting there at the surface watching you. You try to distract them on one side of the boat while you drop the fish off the other side of the boat, and the dolphin immediately goes, head down, tail up, chasing after that fish. And I bet they catch most of them before they can get back down 30 or 40 feet. So how do we deal with something like dolphin predation?
What a great question. And, I want to start to answer that question by commenting on something you said. You said you remember seeing that really big, otherwise healthy, outside of the barotrauma, red snapper just sit there at the surface and float away. And ultimately it was consumed by a predator. I mean, that's almost an inevitable fate for that fish at that point. But your feelings about that fish, I think, are the same feelings that every angler has. No one wants to have to release a fish because of regulatory reasons, either it's too small or you're out of season, and then watch that fish die. Everyone recognizes that that's wanton waste, and nobody wants that. So there is widespread support for ways to try to reduce that, whether it's using a venting tool or a descender device. And really, when you talk about dolphins and the role that these predators have in that exact same scenario, it's difficult. It truly is difficult. And I think the best example of that is you and I can probably count on one hand the number of Gulf of Mexico fishery specific issues that make their way to the US Congress and the Senate where they pass down like a mandate. Well, in 2021, the US Congress mandated that NOAA Fisheries do a comprehensive study and a report detailing and documenting what they call interactions with predators in the Gulf of Mexico reef fish fishery. So whether it's dolphins, exactly like you talked about, or sharks, it's become such a hot topic issue that it literally made its way all the way to Capitol Hill. And the findings of these reports, they can be a little lean. The answer is we don't have a really, really good solution for what to do in these situations. We all know that marine mammals are protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So we obviously can't shoot them. We can't even, fire rubber bullets or anything like that at them. So there's no legal way to dissuade dolphins from consuming those fish that you release. It truly is a problem. And as these dolphin populations continue to be protected, and if those populations continue to grow, then that problem continues to increase. And it's that human wildlife interaction, whether it's the post-release predation or depredation, that we've really spent a lot of time thinking about and studying. And we're trying to examine what are some barriers, for example, to overcoming these negative perceptions that folks have. So I'll give you an example. That Descend Act in 2020 mandates you have to have a descending device and a venting tool on the boat. It doesn't say that you have to use them. You just have to have them on the boat. What we found out is that people were by and large unwilling to use the descender devices because they think attaching a fish to a descender device and dropping it back down is just giving a dolphin or a shark another chance to eat it. So we currently, literally right now, are in the midst of a study where we're paying charter fishermen to document what happens to the fish that they descend using descender devices. We have fancy little cameras on the line. You see a descender device in the fish, and we record whether the fish swims off happily ever after or whether a dolphin or a shark comes and plucks it off of the line. And so these concerns that anglers have are valid and they're reasonable. And it's up to us to do what we can to bridge that knowledge deficit and to say, no, actually, the most recent science shows that if you use these descender devices, the probability of survivorship increases, 80% or 90%. And so therefore, that's a worthwhile endeavor. As more of those studies are being finalized and as more of those results are being shared, it's my hope that folks have a little bit more hope when they're releasing the fish that they catch and don't just think they're automatically going to get eaten.
One thing I've noticed with dolphins in particular is they know if a bait is on the line. So a fish on a descender device is on a line. Usually it's a pretty obvious mechanical device holding onto the fish and a pretty heavy line. Dolphins are smart creatures, so I would imagine they can see that and they would avoid that versus a fish that's trying to swim under its own power down to the reef.
You're absolutely right. And I just want to point out that this isn't just like a nuisance issue for your average recreational fisherman. These are issues that cost the fishing industry and commercial fishermen millions of dollars a year. I would say that the best example of that is the commercial bottom longline for sablefish in Alaska. And estimates suggest that loss in that fishery due to sperm whale depredation, literally sperm whales plucking these sablefish off the line, are in excess of $1 million a year. It's a serious problem. That said, the ways that we try to mitigate that problem really depend on the species we're talking about. So with sharks, we can essentially take advantage of the fact that they have this powerful electromagnetic sense. And we can develop devices that emit strong electrical pulses or magnetic pulses to attempt to deter the shark from a fish being hauled up or released. And the same is true for dolphins or whales. They don't have an electromagnetic sense, but they're very sensitive to acoustic deterrence. So you can employ some of these acoustic deterrents in an attempt to keep dolphins and whales away from fishing gear. So it's It's a problem that we haven't cracked. I mean, there's no silver bullet, but it's something that's the active topic of, so many research projects going on right now.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for listening to Fish University. Do you have a question or a topic for the podcast? If so, you can email me at wes, that's W-E-S, .neal, that's N-E-A-L, at Mississippi State, that's M-S-S-T-A-T-E, .edu. Or instead, please visit the Fish University Facebook page. On the Facebook page, you will find useful articles, videos, stories, and other information, as well as updates on upcoming podcasts. Not to mention, you can send me a private message with questions or suggestions. Just search Fish University and look for our colorful logo. And please follow the Fish University page. We need your support. Now back to the show. Marcus, that's really cool work that you're doing. So what other research do you have going on? I know you were involved in something called the Great Snapper Count. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. I'd really be happy to talk about the Great Red Snapper Count. It's another one of those issues that made its way all the way to Capitol Hill. And the Congress decided in its wisdom, you know what? Let's just dedicate a huge pot of money to a team of scientists in the Gulf, and let's have them do essentially a stock assessment, a certain flavor of a stock assessment. Let's have them estimate the abundance of red snapper in the Gulf, but have them do it in a way that's different from the way that NOAA Fisheries does it. So essentially an independent check on the assessment that's traditionally done. If fishermen are complaining that NOAA Fisheries hasn't gotten the assessment right, let's put this money towards this problem and have a team of academics look at it and see if they come up with something different. And that $10 million slug of money was the Great Red Snapper Count. And I was part of a team of 21 principal investigators, but more accurately, a team of probably like 120 or 130 people between all of the technicians and graduate students and interns and et cetera. And we employed multiple different techniques to try to get at what's seemingly an impossible task. We were literally tasked with counting the number of age 2+ red snapper in the United States Gulf of Mexico. Now, if counting fish in the ocean were an easy thing, then that's how all of our assessments would be done. We would simply count fish. But as anyone can tell you, that's simply not a reasonable request. That said, that's what we attempted to do. And through a number of different techniques over a 2-year period, we came up with an estimate with confidence intervals around that estimate. So an estimate that has some idea of variability, how confident we were in that estimate. And that estimate ended up being about 90 million fish, something like that, 80 to 90 million fish, red snapper, across the Gulf, the U.S. Gulf of Mexico, the U.S. portion of the Gulf of Mexico. Again, you can imagine how seemingly absurd a task like that is. And indeed, it took hundreds of people and millions of dollars and 3 years worth of dedicated effort. But it was a very worthwhile effort because it allowed the public to see that, people hear your problems. Congress hears when, you really have a fundamental disagreement with what the NOAA Fisheries assessment says. And ultimately, we found a number that was different than what NOAA Fisheries would have predicted from their stock assessment. But perhaps not surprisingly, there were some really valid reasons why our number would be expected to be different. For example, given $10 million, we were actually able to sample habitats that had never previously been sampled by NOAA Fisheries. NOAA Fisheries doesn't have the resources to go out in the middle of the ocean, in the middle of nowhere, to see if there happens to be a couple red snapper per nautical mile, or, in the vast open ocean, in the waters 150 meters deep. And as it turns out, as we learned from dragging these sleds with cameras across the entire Gulf of Mexico, essentially like mowing the lawn, as we learned from the mowing the lawn exercise, there is a very low density of these red snapper out on these otherwise unsampled habitats. Now, the density may be low, but you take the volume of that habitat and you expand those two, and all of a sudden, you're talking about a lot of red snapper. The number we found was different than what was predicted by the NOAA Fisheries stock assessment, but for reasons that were easy to explain and that made a lot of sense.
So you were finding them in like places that didn't have what we would consider a good structure for them, like just open areas, flat areas.
That's exactly right. So to be clear, our task was to measure the abundance of red snapper as a function of habitat. And so we had to start off by saying, all right, we define habitat in three categories. There's the artificial habitats. So off Mississippi and Alabama, it's like reef pyramids and things. Louisiana and Texas, it's these big oil rigs. Natural habitat is the second category. So in Florida, lots of just natural rock banks and coral heads and reefs and things like that. But then the third category was something we called unstructured or unclassified habitat. And really, what that turned out to be primarily were oil and gas pipelines. So we don't think about it, but the oil and gas that's produced offshore in Louisiana and Texas ultimately gets piped all the way across the Gulf of Mexico and all the way to Florida. Now, those pipelines are supposed to be buried, but for several reasons, they're often not. And so it might just be a little bit of vertical relief, but in an otherwise featureless landscape, those oil and gas pipelines provide enough relief where they attract even a relatively low density of red snapper. But you extrapolate that over thousands of miles and over, a vast area, and all of a sudden you're talking about a lot of fish. So yes, we found a lot of the red snapper biomass on what we call uncharacterized or unconsolidated bottom. So not the bottom area that your average fisherman is going to go out and fish.
These are areas that are probably relatively unfished by both the recreational and the commercial industry. So do they serve, do you think, as sort of a refuge for replenishing some of the habitats that are fished more heavily?
100%. And as guys like us, we use terms like source sink dynamics. Well, you might have a pool of red snapper relatively close to shore, and let's say that pool is fished at a rate that would not allow it to replenish itself. But then there's this separate pool of red snapper that aren't fished heavily, these ones on this uncharacterized and unconsolidated bottom, and they're able to make contributions to the overall stock that allow the stock as a whole to be rebuilding, even if there's localized, pockets of depletion. So that's exactly what it is. It's a refuge. It's a depth refuge and a geographical refuge. It's out in the middle of nowhere. And so that's exactly what it is. These fish are able to flourish in those environments and ultimately help to replenish the population.
So Marcus, do you have any other research with red snapper you want to talk about?
A lot of our work with red snapper is from an extension standpoint. So, it's exactly what you and I are doing now. It's us translating some of the results from the great red snapper count and letting anglers know what's happening with that. So literally a product that my group is working on right now is one of these fancy kind of web story maps. And it's simply an internet product where you can really quickly scroll through on your phone. And it's almost a frequently asked questions, because what we get a lot from anglers is, okay, Congress paid $10 million for this red snapper study. You guys found something different than NOAA Fisheries. Well, how's NOAA Fisheries using that data? And why, if you found twice as many fish, why can't I harvest twice as many fish? And those are great questions. But as you might expect, the answers are very nuanced. So we're working to provide very clear and simple answers to the questions folks have about what's happening with the results of the great red snapper count. And I'd say that's something that I'm particularly proud of, because we understand the value of the red snapper fishery to every person in the Gulf of Mexico. It truly is an iconic fishery. So that's the red snapper project we're working on right now that I think I'm most proud of.
Well, thank you, Marcus, for coming out here and talking with us today. So do you have any take-home messages or key points about the red snapper fishery that you would like for the public and the anglers to know or to be thinking about? Things you found and some myths you want to dispel, anything like that?
Yeah, so thanks, Wes. I mean, that really is something that's important to me. We've talked about the history of the red snapper fishery. We've talked about how it really crashed and how we've spent a lot of time rebuilding it through some pretty tough management measures, but we're on this upward trajectory. And that's a good thing. Like, that's something we should all be proud of. But if we want to keep that momentum going, I think there's a few key messages that we should remember. First and foremost is the fishery is doing really well. It's a healthy fishery in the Gulf of Mexico, and it's recovering. So while it looks better than it did yesterday, it needs to look even better than that tomorrow. So keep that in mind as you get frustrated with regulations that aren't quite as lenient as you might like. They're put in place for a reason, and we are all going for the same thing, which is a healthy and robust red snapper fishery. So that's one point. Another point I'd really like to stress is try not to worry about catching the absolute biggest red snapper you can. If you're allowed 2 fish per person per day, and the first 2 fish you catch are legal size, but they're only 8 pounds a piece, and you really wanted like a 12 pounder. Carefully ponder the decision to throw that fish back in the attempt to catch another bigger fish, right? The more people high grade, the more post-release mortality is experienced by the fishery, the more dolphins and sharks learn that when they see a boat pull up to a reef, there's going to be opportunities where people are just throwing back fish. Be satisfied with the fish that you catch that are legal size and that are in season, and I would strongly suggest that. And the third thing is, for fish that you want to return back to the water, I'll use a common catchphrase in a program that we're a part of, and that is return them right. If you're going to release a fish back to the water, return them right. And so the way to do that is at least twofold. For fish that are clearly undersized and that have no barotrauma, right? You caught them shallow, there's no bulging eyes, no protruding stomach. Use a dehooker. Try to touch the fish as little as possible. Use a dehooker, get that fish right back into the water as quickly as possible. That's going to increase its chances of surviving. If you need to handle the fish, and or if the fish has experienced barotrauma, big bulging eyes or fizzing scales, a stomach protruding from the opening of its mouth, use one of the tools at your disposal, either a venting tool or ideally a descending device. Those things work really well, and current studies show that depredation when you're using those is not really a concern. So you can feel confident that the fish you release with a descending device is going to contribute to the population and either produce more eggs and add to the commercial fishery, or maybe provide a chance for you to catch and release that fish in the future. So if folks can focus on those 3 things for Gulf of Mexico red snapper, I think the future tomorrow is even brighter than the current state of the fishery today.
All very good words to live by, Marcus. Thank you so much for coming on with us today. Really enjoyed having you here, and I'm definitely going to have you back to talk about some of the other species that you're working with.
Yes, please. And thank you very much for having me, Wes. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
And thanks, everybody, for listening to Fish University. I hope to hear you back here next time. Have a good one. Fish University is hosted by Wes Neal, an employee of Mississippi State University Extension Service and a faculty member in the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Aquaculture. This podcast is part of the Natural Resources University network of podcasts. Funding was provided by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you have questions or suggestions, please go to the Extension website at extension.mississippistate.edu. Click on Natural Resources and then select the Fisheries tab in the drop-down menu. Or you can email me at wes.neal@msstate.edu.